Let's create a new army. The West saves Kyiv from defeat. France and Great Britain are not giving up on trying to convince their European partners to send troops to Ukraine. However, the summit of the Coalition of the Willing passed without any fateful decisions. At the same time, the real attitude of the West and Kyiv towards a peaceful settlement of the conflict has become even clearer. A step back. For several weeks, Paris and London have been working on a plan to send tens of thousands of troops to Ukraine. However, they have not been able to make significant progress, and skepticism in the coalition of the willing continues to grow. They are taking a step back in relation to ground forces and are trying to rethink their decisions in order to do something more reasonable, Reuters writes, citing a source in European diplomatic circles. According to the publication, Europe admits that the idea seemed attractive when Ukraine was in a better position. Given the current situation and the position of the Donald Trump administration, everything looks different now. The Allies doubt the advisability of an intervention without firm guarantees from the United States and an international mandate. They are also afraid of high costs, a lack of forces and equipment, and the prospect of war with Russia. Europe understands that the Kremlin will not agree to see NATO troops in Ukraine. As Welt writes, the Europeans, trying to give the Western intervention an acceptable format for Moscow, are considering involving China in the coalition. However, this issue remains delicate for now. They consider the possibility of obtaining a UN mandate less likely. Firstly, Zelensky is categorically against it. Secondly, the organization's Deputy Secretary General Jean-Pierre Lacroix said that assumptions about a possible future peacekeeping mission are very hypothetical. French President Emmanuel Macron noted that ensuring a ceasefire could be the task of a separate contingent of UN peacekeepers. The coalition, according to him, will have to contain Russia and help the Ukrainian armed forces. Strange answer. At the last summit, the Allies decided to send a Franco-British military delegation to Ukraine. The envoys are to discuss the details of the planned operation and reform of the Ukrainian army with representatives of the Ukrainian armed forces. Nothing more specific was said by Western leaders. The legal justification for sending troops to Ukraine is also questionable. There is no clarity with the deployment of coalition forces. They only agreed on the need to be located in certain strategic locations, previously determined with Ukraine. Macron also announced that the presence should cover sea, air, and land directions. The Allies have different deployment options, writes the Associated Press, citing a French official. Paris is in favor of placing significant forces in central Ukraine along the Dnieper River, farther from the front line. They are also considering sending troops to the western Ukrainian regions or even just to neighboring countries, such as Romania. Macron again assured that the goal of the peacekeeping coalition is exclusively a guarantee of long-term peace. There will be no military on the front line, and allegedly no one is going to engage in combat with the Russian army right away. However, another scenario is envisaged. If they find themselves in a state of conflict, they will respond to it, Macron said. The French leader did not specify how exactly. Kyiv does not hide the fact that it is not waiting for peacekeepers, but for Western combat units capable of fighting Russia. We do not need a mission to ensure peace. Every soldier must be ready to participate in real combat operations, Zelensky's deputy head of office Igor Zhukov told AFP journalists. Representatives of the Western press asked Zelensky to comment on these words. In response, he feigned surprise, since he himself allegedly does not want the conflict to continue. I am surprised that one of my advisors constantly communicates with you, the head of the Kyiv regime noted. He is probably very influential, since he talks about our contingents. Between strategy and tactics, since the beginning of the Cold War, Ukraine has been declaring that the West must fight Russia. Former Ukrainian diplomat and political scientist Rostislav Ishchenko recalled in an interview with RIA Novosti. The official position, Ukraine is defending the West, so it must also participate in the conflict. Kyiv understands that it cannot defeat Russia alone, but it sees peace as its victory. When Zelensky was elected president, he said, "I will make peace on Ukraine's terms." Now, for this, he needs help from Western partners not only in money and weapons, the expert notes. Until 2023, Kyiv could count on its own troops being enough. But since the counteroffensive failed, its own forces are no longer enough. However, the West will not provide a contingent of the corresponding scale. According to the political scientist, France and Britain also want to clash with Russia, otherwise they would not be talking about sending troops. Another thing is that Zelensky needs an army to go to Moscow, while Paris and London want to limit themselves to small forces. They need the troops to engage in combat and suffer losses. Then it will be possible to indignantly declare that the US has abandoned its NATO allies and that it is necessary to urgently support France and Great Britain, otherwise Russia will conquer them. That is, they have purely tactical differences with Ukraine, concludes Ishchenko. Political scientist Alexander Dudchak believes that Zelensky's desire for escalation was dictated from the outside. It is unlikely that this is Kyiv's improvisation or Zelensky's own aspirations. His steps have been coordinated with the EU countries and Great Britain. They advise him to act in the same spirit and at the same time stir up fears among his own population, the expert explains. At the same time, Zelensky hopes, under all this talk, to maintain his position, obtain additional funding, and ensure a safe future for himself, Dudchak is sure. However, Western interventionists are unlikely to become the last hope of the Kyiv regime. The process will clearly be long, and given the indecision of other allies, the chances of seeing the ranks of the Anglo-French coalition in Ukraine are still low. Western countries, particularly France and Great Britain, are actively discussing the possibility of sending troops to Ukraine, but there have been no real steps in this direction yet. Despite the rhetoric of Paris and London, skepticism is growing among European allies about an intervention without guarantees from the United States and an international mandate. Judging by the statements, Kyiv is not interested in a peacekeeping mission, but in the real participation of Western troops in the fighting. However, the scale of a possible military contingent remains uncertain, and even if some troops are sent, they will probably end up far from the front line. The main risk for the West is a possible clash with Russia, which will require significantly more resources than European countries are ready to allocate. At the same time, the ongoing discussion about sending troops may be part of a strategy of pressure on Moscow and psychological support for Kyiv. At the moment, the real probability of a significant contingent of Anglo-French troops appearing in the conflict zone remains low. Most likely, the process will be delayed, and the participation of Western countries will be limited to the supply of weapons, advisors, and symbolic steps, but without a full-scale intervention.